Thank you. Welcome back, and welcome back to our wonderful speakers. I really enjoyed your talks. I didn't get the chance to say thank you personally, but yeah, good times. My ambition with this is to get as many questions from the audience as possible, and also to take the heat off these guys. I'm going to solicit some answers from the audience as well. So we'll see how that goes. We've got about half an hour to chat together. I'm going to get some countdown minutes from Dave. Let's start off, to warm you up, with some show of hands questions. So I'm going to ask 3 questions, and I want you to raise your hands on my command. So first off, you've heard a lot about trust and safety AI models in the 3 talks we just had. By the way, these are going to be like provocative enough to break the ice, to let you ask as provocative questions as you want. So AI in trust and safety has the benefits as espoused by our speakers, but it might come with risks as well. So gut feeling, raise your hand if you think the benefits outweigh the risks. Okay, and gut feeling if you think the risks outweigh the benefits. A few hands. I expected it to be more split than that. Dropped my notes, that's a good start. Okay, second raise hands question. Are businesses who are practicing trust and safety with AI on top of the risks? So raise your hands for if you think businesses are able to manage the risks of using AI in trust and safety. Wow. Bumble team says that we're doing great. Okay. And a few other hands around the audience. So presumably, who thinks businesses are not on top of the risks? Many more hands. There we go. Final question from me, then I'll shut up. In terms of building trust and safety systems, would you trust a human system more or an AI system more? So raise your hands if you would trust a human system more than AI system. Loads of hands. Oh dear. An AI system? Okay, that one was split. Good. Right, I'm going to open up with one question and then we'll take questions from the audience. There's a roaming mic, which looks like a big yellow cube. Thank you. But just because 2 of you have already mentioned it, open source models. You mentioned Detoxify and Bumble's own private detector. Are you, all 3 of you, are you aware of other open source trust and safety models? What's out there?
There are several models out there. There's an image, like nudity detector that some companies use. I think it's called NudeNet, is an open source model. And there's a variety of like text-based models. We built Detoxify based on a Kaggle challenge, which was basically a data set, label data set people put out on the internet to encourage people to try and build models. And so there are loads of models that were built for the back of this to try and identify toxic content.
Yes, definitely. I feel like Google search is my friend. I know that like Deep AI has a similar like lewd photo. It's not. I think it's a more NSFW picture detecting model. Yeah, there are a lot of open source projects on GitHub. It's all for the taking.
Thanks.
I mean, yes, the answer is yes. However, like we work with lots of platforms, and I do think for like smaller online platforms, it's really hard to find cheap, affordable solutions that cover all the harms. But I do know Google recently also made public at least some API for like child nudity detection, which is something that you cannot build in-house because owning the content is illegal. So we do depend on some organizations out there for that.
Okay, so over to you for audience questions. I'm going to open up by inviting you to ask specific questions about the talks you've heard, if there are any, and then we'll move to more general ones. So some hands up over here. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question for Sasha. You mentioned that you have this model that processes all different modalities. How exactly does that work? Are you processing it in parallel? Are you processing it like sequentially? I imagine like it requires a lot of computational power and also to get everything working very smoothly to be able to get performance. Can you share some details on that, the kind of stuff that you're allowed to share?
I can try. And luckily there's some Unitary machine learning engineers here as well, so afterwards, please do go and pick their brains. They're in the front row. Yes, the models are genuinely multimodal. So what does that mean? We get a video and we pull out all the signals of the video. So that's the image frames, the audio signal, there might be OCR like text on the screen, associated like titles or captions, like text information. And we then put all of these different modalities into a single model that looks at all the different frames. So it kind of has some awareness of frames in the order that they appear, as well as all the different other signals. And that is a model that generally takes into account lots of inputs to predict with all of those signals whether something might be harmful or not. It is computationally really tough. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we faced was how can we actually deploy these models at scale? How can we process millions of videos a day? And we had to develop really complicated infrastructure systems that can sort of scale up and down according to demand. So if a customer sends us 1 million videos, how can we suddenly spin up enough servers to deal with that and then sort of scale back down again? But that's been one of the things that maybe we're most proud of because it was really, really tough.
Maybe close microphone, whatever helps. Thank you so much for me as well. I'm a founder of a nonprofit for a lot of scam victims, so my question is a bit more into catfishing and fake profiles. And I really talk about a lot of new technology, but I have felt so many fraud victims are coming to me and there's tons of fake profiles still on all the data nets. And even when you report them to Facebook, they're still there. So I'm wondering, are these companies or you guys using fake check ID and all these as well? Or why are there so many fake profiles still on these apps? Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a fair question. I think that unfortunately, there's like a sociological point to this, which is there are a lot of bad actors. And as a company, what we can do is continually be guided by principles like privacy by design and safety by design to develop a toolkit that, we can either proactively and reactively detect fake profiles and scammers. I think, yeah, it's a problem that we are working on at Bumble, other companies are working on, and it is front of mind. There are a host of tools. So I think, scammers, so I think you were saying in your talk, Yu-Lan, that they kind of, once like scammers learn certain patterns, they figure out how to kind of circumvent the systems that you've put in place. So it's a constant act in constantly, staying one step ahead or two steps ahead. So it's a work in progress. And I think, unfortunately, there's never going to be a system that is 100% foolproof. So it is going to be, a work in progress always. And I know that that's probably not what you want to hear. I don't want to hear that either as someone who's like using a dating app. Like I don't want to come across a profile that's fake, but we just have to keep like working to combat this. I don't know if any of you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I can just agree. It's really hard. And like from my experience, people just get really good at detecting. So like, for example, at Meta, detecting fake profiles at sign up has become relatively easy. But then bad actors starting saying like, oh, wait, if I can't create a new profile because they'll detect my IP or whatever, or my email address or other behavior, then I can just hack someone else's profile and use that one. And then it becomes really hard because then you have all these genuine signals combined with like these new weird signals. And then it's a bit like, oh, what's happening now? And so people are just getting really good at it. And so it's a never ending rat race, really, which is a sad answer. So, and to add to that, I do think that lots of education is important, which makes it sad. Like we shouldn't, like the victims shouldn't be the ones having to be accountable. But I do think like just education in school about how to be healthy online, the same way we're learning to be healthy in the offline world, and like maybe not talk to strangers after 11 p.m. at night. Sadly, I think it's an important part that we become a bit more assertive as well.
Yeah, sounds good.
Viewpoint, I'll throw. Is there any more? We're going to go in an order.
Take that one
Oh,
first.
there's so many. We're going down the far end. You're making me work, Will.
Get your
You can
step
take it.
down now. So just to rephrase your question, are you asking that how, like, are other people using this technology? How are they thinking about keeping people safe?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because it's a commercial, you share it and like, so you can keep that for yourself as a experience, it's basically sharing that to someone, that's what it's saying, working together
Yeah, I think that, I mean, fair, it's a fair point. But I feel like keeping people safe on the internet should not be sort of a unique selling point, but rather something that is, you know, the default. And I think that's kind of the motivating factor for why we decided to open source Private Detector. And I imagine why, you know, you're working on so many open source projects. It's like the vision to keep people safe. Did you want to?
Definitely. I mean, if we can make the internet safer, that's our, mission accomplished. And so that's why we would open source things. But also, I think it drives an awareness of what the problems are having more open source models out there. We don't open source everything. I mean, maybe that's the discussion we should have one day. But having open source models that we can write about and send to people gives people, even people who don't necessarily have the budgets to implement solutions, a tool to do something when they're starting out, and get people more aware of like what you can do with AI, so people aren't so dependent necessarily on just human moderation.
I have something to add there. It's less about dating, but more within the industry, within the trust and safety industry. There are tech company-wide efforts to create image banks of child abusive material that then can be used by all the other platforms, and the same for terrorist material. So there are lots of efforts out there to share this knowledge in the best and privacy-aware way possible, so that other platforms, definitely smaller ones, don't have to like try and build this stuff from scratch.
I'll just jump in with one related question. So open sourcing AI tools for trust and safety is kind of beneficial for those who want to make use of it in other platforms. But we've also seen open source AI tools be used by bad actors. So one example from Bumble is that it's possible to fake photo verification. When you're onboarding, when you're creating a profile, you can use generative image models to verify your photo when it's not actually of you. So on balance, would you say that the AI tools are helping the bad actors win the arms race, or the sort of the good actors, platforms?
I personally believe that good will always prevail. And I think it forces us to become more creative. I spoke with a company called Yoti, and they do identity and age verification. And I think they have systems in place to take videos. So, I mean, obviously, then again, like you can generate videos, but it's just like always adding that extra step. So I think it keeps us on our toes. So I will leave it at that.
I think for a particular model, if you open source it, people can figure out how can you get around it. So you need to be a bit more creative than just having, your one model that's the open source as the only sort of gatekeeper. But the more people that are aware of the problem, that start to use open source models to develop their own tools, I think does net good, because it makes more and more people sort of get interested in this as a problem. And I think part of the challenge is that content moderation isn't the most sexy problem, and it's not something that sort of everyone's working on for their master's thesis, but maybe it should be.
Any answers to this from the audience before we take more questions? Yes, please.
With respect to trying to keep up with the because it's basically a moving target, isn't it? I mean, so in this era of generative AI, one has to pretty much have a model that is ever changing itself. So as your data, what you feed into the model is, it's, you can think of it as a distribution. That's changing, then equally you got to then retrain your model and do some, kind of keep up with, the landscape. I was just wondering, is this something that you guys consider? So, I mean, it's one thing to have a model that's out there in the wild, but then, as we all know, things are changing. So is it that your models are ever kind of being retuned to kind of adapt to, the changing landscape?
I'll start. 100%. And that's been the issue before generative AI has suddenly taken off and caused all sorts of new deepfake related harms. But for example, the way that people speak, there's something called algo speak, and the word people use to describe sex or drugs or whatever, and the sort of code language that people use is constantly evolving. And the sort of metaphors that people use. And so we have to constantly be training and retraining and collecting more data and retraining models to keep up with the ever-changing sort of state of online harm. And that generative AI is just part of that story.
Thank you.
Some very patient people at the back who've got questions. So Dave. Over there at the back.
I need more descriptions, Will, to be honest. We're at the back. Who are we here? There you go.
Thank you. So I currently work with a founder that's building a tech platform to protect sex workers. So obviously super interested in what you all had to say, and I'm really behind Bumble. I'm a huge fan, so thank you for that video around the aubergine. I'm here for it. Basically, I'm just wondering if, I suppose when it comes to vulnerable groups, when you, especially maybe someone like Bumble, when you're considering protecting vulnerable groups that sometimes aren't considered when building AI, how do you get buy-in? How do you get policymakers to reconsider? Have you also been in the room where maybe 5 years ago, where people were the conversation around trans, where people just weren't having that conversation? How did you manage the pushback and get stakeholders on board? I know there's multiple there, but I suppose it's just stakeholder buy-in when you're, trying to protect everyone, including the people that are often forgotten as well.
I would say that I'm a little bit biased here because I feel like Bumble makes it a little bit easy not to give a cop-out response, but I feel like the buy-in does come from, our leadership, and I think that is a part of being driven by certain values. It is a tricky question though, because when you're kind of working with the wind as opposed to working against the wind. But in our case, I think we are very strong in our in our desire to work to kind of make the experiences better for marginalized identities. Having said that, there's always room for improvement, right? And so, yeah, I would say we're doing good, but we could be doing better. We could be doing more, so.
I think if I can add here, I think what really stood out to me is consensual and unsolicited. And again, you're given the choice back, and that's where I would also argue with sex workers. Nobody wants to go into it because they have to. Obviously, I'm coming from, again, it's like a marginalised point of view, but they're still a group, they're still a group to be protected, just like you don't go around flashing in public. So cyber flashing should obviously, be banned as well. The same goes for sex workers. And then other vulnerable groups that we have out there as well, are they being considered? How do we, I suppose, I'm just kind of looking at what you're all doing. And if, within the AI space, would you say that you're starting to get buy-in from people that you wouldn't have got buy-in before? Especially around policy, the non-consensual thing, it's okay to get a DP, a DP, I'm not going to say it out loud, but it's also okay to say it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a policy team. Like our policy team is hard at work at defining what we think is acceptable on Bumble, what we think isn't acceptable at Bumble. So it's kind of, for the lack of like the buzzword use, which is it is a cross-functional effort, really.
It could be good for Yu-Lan, actually. Now that you've left Meta, can you like just say whatever you want?
Yeah.
Cool.
I know
So
I
what did
signed
Meta
some things
do,
when I left,
Yu-Lan?
but here we go.
Tell us.
Sadly, the answer from my experience is that things change when bad things happen. It's very reactive. And I don't think it's because of bad intent, it's resources. Like trust and safety is such a cost center. Like it's very hard to prove the value of trust and safety, even though like there's probably ways to show that it relates to retention. It's hard to actually say that this won't hit the bottom line. And so from my experience, if something bad happens, then things change. And so, for example, when I was working in suicide detection, we sadly had an incident because we weren't covering a certain language. And then afterwards we were covering this language. And then bear in mind, obviously it's easy to blame Facebook, but they cover almost all the languages in the world. And that's a really big, hard and costly problem. So that's one example. But personally, I believe in policy. So definitely companies can set policies on being transparent around bias, generally, vulnerable groups, but also bias. One example, I mentioned Yoti, the age verification provider. They actually provide reports every year on the bias of their algorithms of non-white people, of their age and age estimation. And so that's something that I think is really admirable that they publish this. And I believe that what can really help drive is lobbying. If people can lobby for this and be look, big platforms have to provide statistics on how their data performs on different sets of users and different ethnicities, I think that could be a start.
There's a question from the person in the red shirt there, Dave, back row.
Will, could I take one? Because I've been heckled here.
Oh, okay.
Could we do one and then come to the red
I've been
shirt straight
overruled,
after?
yes. Go for it.
Are you ready for this?
Yes.
Come on. I could tell you're ready.
I did not heckle. Really interesting and insightful conversation today, so thank you. And it's also great to see three women sitting up here, so yeah, props to you all. I just wanted to ask... as we know, this is a changing landscape and legislation is slowly trying to keep up. I just wanted to hear some views on the incoming Digital Services Act. Do you think this is going to address some of the issues that we've spoken about today? Just keen to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Should I start? Yes, I think the answer is yes, in the sense that it's already changing the industry. From where I stand and the people we talk with, they are worried about it. I think the intent is good. The execution depends. I do think that the push for transparency, so actually under the Digital Services Act in Europe, it means that companies with more than 45 million users, which is basically the big tech platforms, and I think the only EU platform was Zalando maybe, and I think also Wikimedia is US, right? Don't quote me wrongly. And they'll have to publish a whole series of transparency reporting, doing risk assessments on their platform. So I do think it's a good push for transparency. I think sadly for the smaller platforms, it adds a lot of overhead. And even though it's a good thing, some platforms I don't think will be able to keep up with it. But added to that, I just think even if maybe the first iterations won't be great or won't have the desired outcome, it gets people talking. And I think that's a really important thing. It gets people talking, it creates awareness, and then there's the Brussels effect, where other countries are making similar regulations, similar to the DSA. In the UK, there's an online safety bill as well. So I do think that the intent is good. The first execution will probably be a bit messy, but I do hope that it will create more awareness and more good regulation.
Okay, can we come to red shirt at the back then, Dave?
No, here you go. Sorry.
Hi, thank you very much for creating these tools to make the internet a lot safer. One question I have is that when it comes to curating these potentially dangerous data sets, I presume it actually requires a human to sit down and go through the images or videos to actually label them. So how would you also protect these people who are being exposed to these very dangerous material constantly being bombarded? Because I imagine it could be quite triggering and traumatizing. Is there some hidden human cost that us benefiting the system that we're not actually aware of, and how do we protect them?
Any questions, answers from the audience as well? And welcome. It's all
Have a
you,
go.
Sasha.
I mean, the name of the game is stopping people from being in the firing line for looking at this content. And so if you can reduce the number of people that have to look at it, then that's a success. Definitely, having well-labeled data is really, really important. So like a question I think we try and answer, or try and ask ourselves, is can we make use of data that's being labeled by our customers, maybe like from their manual moderation teams anyway, as training data? And we do get labeled data from our customers to do that. We also have our own labeling team, and we try and decide the kind of content that we're going to send, and we use our models to kind of narrow down on what kind of content we should look at and have labeled. But yeah, it's a really like important problem.
In terms of doing this at scale, like having worked now and previously with companies who have like hundreds and thousands of moderators, it's still necessary, but there's lots of things in place that can make it a bit less bad. But it's still like, I really admire content moderators, like the things that they go through and see. But there's ways of like blurring images, like if you see unsolicited adult nudity, blurring the image probably gives you a good idea of what is there. For images that are very graphic or gore, like suicidal images, like having black and white can make it less like triggering. And then for videos, it's like often handy to have a storyboard so that they don't have to go through the whole video, but that there's like screenshots of specific images, or if there's audio on the video, translate them to text and just highlight the bad words, and actually give moderators a bit of control to make it as like to minimize the risk. Like there's no way to remove the harm done, sadly. So that's on the technical side. So I think as product people and tech people, we can do a lot there. And then within bigger companies, like moderators are supposed, I know that it doesn't always happen, but they're supposed to have like mental breaks and mental support as well, to help deal with it and be able to talk. And then personally, I'm a big believer of like balancing. So making sure that people who work on very serious harms, that they can also alternate with less serious harms to moderate.
Yeah, I think that, the spectrum of harms, it's a pretty wide spectrum. And so appropriate precautions have to be taken depending on the kind of content that someone is seeing. Actually, when I was prepping for this presentation, I was thinking a lot about like, what are other ways in which we could be leveraging like private detector, for instance. And like you said, content moderation is a great, application for it. And also I think that something like, suicide or terrorism has kind of a different type of harm that could be borne by a moderator. So I think a lot of companies actually have come under fire for not taking, they kind of outsource the moderation tasks and are no longer like liable for the mental health essentially of their moderators. And I think even like the public reception and the public criticism that like a lot of big companies have kind of enabled them, like something bad needs to happen for the good to follow. And I think that the public lashback from couple years ago has slowly but surely started kind of the snowball of change.
Great answers, thanks. More questions then? Yeah, I can't remember who was first. Let's go in the middle then.
Perfect. I think this is the 10-minute warning wheel. I've not done the secret signal that I promised.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. Just wanted to find out, is there any sort of like support, guidance and sort of training you get from, say, for example, law enforcement? Or is it down to, the policy of the company and morals before you refer to the authorities? Even then, if there is a conviction, of course, they might not be able to allow to be use a computer for X amount of time. But if there's no conviction, how do you prevent people from rejoining your platform and just behaving in the same way?
I think that, first of all, I think every company would first and foremost ensure that they're compliant with whatever legislation is is live in the country that they're in. And obviously this differs from country to country. So it obviously changes like if you are, what country you're operating in and if you're operating in more than one country. So definitely legislation-based safeguards are put in. And I think in addition to that, policy teams will work to, determine if somebody is perpetrating some kind of harm, if we kind of block them or we ban them or we kind of warn them. So there are different kind of layers of what a company might allow, but I would say legislation and then like the policies that are determined by the company.
Happy to take another question unless there's more answers. Dave, where do you want to go? Okay, across the aisle then.
Thank you. Thank you for your talks. My question on technical side. So Sasha already alluded that for their solution, they had to develop something to cope with large volumes. I understand that a lot of large vendors like Google, Amazon, Microsoft are moving into AI and ML space. So have you analyzed what they're offering? To what extent you are able or were able to use them, and to what extent did you have to develop something and yourself, and why?
So is the question, how have we analysed how our models compare to, say, AWS's own
to
models?
whatever is offered by them, and why did you decide to do it yourself rather than using, to some extent, so something you do yourself, something you use from them, so to what extent?
Yeah, so we do analyse what's available. So AWS have an image product called AWS Recognition. Google Cloud have an image API as well, and they have video things too. So we basically try and benchmark ourselves against them regularly and make sure that we're outperforming them. And how can we outperform these big companies is a question. And I guess the few answers to that. One is that this isn't their core business, and it's what we do every day. And so we're constantly learning from our customers. We're getting feedback all the time. We're in the line of fire when things go wrong, and they're not. And that forces us to learn, adapt, and evolve our models to actually respond to the real life scenarios. So that's one thing. The second thing is that they're not adapting, they're not updating all the time, and they're also not very scalable. Even though these are huge tech companies, sometimes their like cost structure means that they're only really sort of viable for companies that have relatively low volumes of content to run through their API and be able to sort of pay the costs. So building something for us that was like highly accurate but also highly scalable was like the biggest goal.
My question would be to Namrata. Did you do any research whether the feature of like sending pictures in private chat is so differentiating that it's actually, did you do any research whether the feature of sending pictures in private chat is so differentiating that it's actually worth doing this whole thing, not just disable it and then like half of the problem is gone?
So, sorry, what was that? I couldn't hear you too well.
So did you do any research, like tests, whether the ability to send pictures in private chats is so like important for the user, so differentiating, that if you disable it, and the problem, like most of the problem is gone?
It's a good question. And I think actually it's kind of a product, it's a product question, right? Like what do we want to, what kind of features we want to have on our products versus not. It's ultimately like, a camera is a tool, and you could take great pictures from with a camera, and you could take horrible pictures with a camera. So the question is not like, should we just get rid of the camera? Because it's kind of great, right? So I think then it just comes down to like the product question of like, what can we, like, what do we want, like what tools do we want, people to have to form meaningful connections? So yeah.
The question is more whether you tested the two options, right? Having it or not having it.
I am not privy to all of the various like experiments that were done, so I wouldn't be able to answer that.
I guess the other question is, what would you be looking for in such a test? I mean, the kind of results from the test are a decision themselves, so. Okay, some questions from the back of the room. Yes, there's three. So Dave, to the very back, please.
It's really making me work hard. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
One more from you afterwards.
Thanks for the talk. I want to know a bit more about the product decisions that I made with this data. How are the conversations, and maybe we cannot talk about that in Bumble, but happy to talk about that, but how maybe a hypothesis that somebody that is trying to be a predator is willing to pay money and increase your revenue, and therefore by banning them, you actually decrease your own revenue. So how have you seen those conversations play out in your work? Or is this something that you just like push to policy and say, you deal with it? I know that we're in Bumble, so we might not be able to talk about this, but.
Maybe I'll pass on that. Maybe I'll pass on that.
Does anyone want to give an answer?
Yu-Lan, what did Meta do?
I can talk.
Tell us.
You know, it's so good to be on the other side, right? It's a really good question. I can say that personally, I've worked with platforms and they just don't want bad actors. Because even if short-term revenue will grow, like long-term engagement of all the victims will create decreased user engagement, but also brand. Like if a platform allows these type of things, it's just a type of brand. That's why there's platforms like Facebook, where there's also Gab and 4chan, and they all have different types of reputations because of the policies. That's one thing. The other thing is that at Facebook, there were two counter forces. There was the growth team, who's focused on user growth, and there was the integrity team, and they would get in a room together on all the product decisions and weigh off, and they would follow a product framework and a risk framework to make sure that both parties are heard and that everyone can give feedback.
Okay, I think we'll take one final question, Dave. Front row of high chairs there.
Hi, my question is, how much of the disturbing photos are scrutinized by manually on your platform, and how much of them are now by AI, and how far do you think in the future the majority of the job can be done by the AI? Because I've heard read some documents, a lot of scrutinizing these disturbing pictures are done by some developing countries, people in developing countries, which is quite bad for their mental health as well, because some pictures can be really, really bad. And so I was asking, how far would there be an AI could do the majority of this job? Yeah, and could be in a way that do it, quite accurately. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, with our models, we are able to automate quite a lot of the work. As we iterate on the model in the future, circumstances may change, but at this point, we have a lot of information already that we can leverage. So, and the question is about how do we make the most out of what we already have, as opposed to sort of having to create the same type of data set over and over again. So I think that at this point, we're able to automate a lot of it.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much to our speakers for doubling down on their work and answering all of your questions.